In addition to being a very good friend, and I want that up front first to claim that, in addition to that, Anna Carter Florence is the Peter Marshall Associate Professor of Homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Drama from Yale University and earned her Master of Divinity and her PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. Anna has a passionate interest in so many things that I could not begin to name them all, but among them are youth, poetics, feminist theology, and more. But what has always impressed me about her is her passion for the Word, a word that continues to create, delight, surprise, sometimes to shock, but a word that always gives life. She has served that word as a pastor, preacher, lecturer, and now as a teacher of the church. And in whatever capacity she has served, her teaching and preaching is regularly characterized by a tenacious and creative wrestling with the Word that never fails to yield a word of life and health for us today. For this reason, she is a highly sought-after lecturer and preacher, and we are delighted to welcome her here today. Please join me.
I'm going up here. I'm going to get him in a little bit. You wait, I really am. Okay. How are y'all doing, by the way, at the worst pedagogical time of the day? You okay? Okay, I noticed that in this chapel, as in many chapels, the acoustics for speaking are not what they might be, and since I won't be singing to you, I want you, if it starts to get muddy, or if it starts to, if you can't hear me, to just kind of gesture in some way, okay? And we'll figure out what it is that I'm saying to you. Okay, I have a title. It's not in the bulletin. It's about biblical preaching, but the subtitle is Goliath, Charlemagne, Survivor Man, and Us. Okay? That's just if you want to know. Okay, last fall, I went to Wisconsin. Yeah. I spent 3 days in 3 different cities with pastors, all kinds of pastors, from all over the state. It was a wonderful trip. I met great people. I learned a lot. And we talked about biblical preaching and what a Goliath it is, you know? This Philistine giant that shows up every morning and yells at you, "Give me a sermon text that we may fight together," and then laughs at you. Really, that's how it feels. To be a biblical preacher is to face the same old Goliath every day with no army to back you up. So we talked about that last fall in Wisconsin, how much we want to be biblical preachers and how hard it is to sustain that week after week, and where we go for help or ideas or support when we're tired, including all those places on the internet. Here it comes, the good ones like www.workingpreacher.com. The good ones, right? And then the not so good ones that I'm sure you've discovered. And what it means to be a biblical preacher in an internet age, when there is so much stuff available to you at a few clicks. And then one afternoon in Appleton, a pastor stood up and asked the question that I think everyone else was thinking but was afraid to ask. Okay, he said, we are biblical preachers, and we're all looking for inspiration on the internet. We are not looking to plagiarize. What do you think of pastors, preachers, who encourage others to preach their sermons? Take Rick Warren, for example, this pastor said. If you go, he said, to the Saddleback Church website, you can download Pastor Rick's sermons for a small fee, use them devotionally or preach them yourself to your own congregation. You can even subscribe and get those sermons every week. So, this pastor asked if Rick Warren is okay with us preaching his sermons, if he doesn't mind, should we? What a great question. And, it seems, a historical question. Because at that moment, I suddenly remembered we are not the first persons to ask this. Preachers have been asking if they could get a little help, please, with their sermons, since Jesus gave the Great Commission to go forth, baptize, preach, teach every week, again and again. There has never been enough time to do it all. We have always wanted to borrow someone else's sermons, someone with a track record, like Augustine, someone like John the Baptist. But it is one thing to be invited to borrow, and another thing to be told to do it by the emperor. Okay, this is an unusual move for me. I do not normally make excursions into the deep historical past, and as my friends will tell you, I'm not the first person to call when you have a pressing need to know right now which pope presided over the Arian controversy. I can look it up, but it is not immediately accessible in short-term memory. But at that moment in Appleton, Wisconsin, I had what can only be called a blast from the past. What do you think of preachers like Rick Warren who encourage other preachers to preach their sermons? I think Charlemagne would be thrilled for all of us to preach Rick Warren's sermons. Emperor Charlemagne in 800 and before. Because that was his project, to get everyone in the empire to preach the same sermon at the same time so he could control what the people heard. All right, I can say this because I live in Atlanta. Charlemagne was a good old boy in the best sense of that word. There is a best sense of that word. He would, right? I've got people from Georgia right here in front of me. They know it's not necessarily a bad thing to be called a good old boy, where we come from, okay? Charlemagne was hardy, he was earnest, he was a great warrior, and he was a patriot. He really wanted to bring peace to that tortured collection of fiefdoms that we now know as Europe. So, even though he was as brilliant and imposing in battle as Mel Gibson in a kilt, he knew, I am told he was. He knew that emperors do not survive by military force alone. There are other forces equally as powerful that an emperor can use to his advantage. One is education. Another is religion. And applied together, you could create a Holy Roman Empire if you wanted, a Reich to end all Reichs. You know that, right? Charlemagne's was the first Holy Roman Empire. Bismarck's was the second. Whose was the third? Yeah, Hitler. You could create, if you wanted, a Reich to end all Reichs, one language, one religion, one culture, and that was the idea. So Charlemagne called together the best minds of his day, and he told them his vision, and together they drafted a plan. The first thing they did was to educate the monarch himself. Not a lot, but some. Charlemagne was a realist. Does a 7-foot-tall emperor who rules most of the known world really need a PhD to get more respect? Probably not. But a modicum of education, learning how to read, for example, well, sure, yeah, why not? So, Charlemagne hired Alcuin of York, the great scholar of the day, to be his teacher. And after a few years, when Charlemagne considered himself educated enough to educated enough, they turned their attention to the rest of the empire, schools and churches and literacy for the common folk. Soon it became clear that the most efficient way to educate the masses wasn't to give them a little book learning and leave it at that. The most efficient thing was to make them go to church week after week and listen to sermons, the right sermons, biblical sermons that were especially geared to new converts, that would teach them moral values and civic duty and basic Christian precepts. This was important since Charlemagne was a zealous missionary. He usually gave his conquered subjects a choice between one death, two baptism. So he figured the most efficient way to build Christendom was to build a better sermon and order the priests to preach it. Then you knew exactly what your citizens were getting. It was a massive project. It required massive legislation. You may not know this, but most priests at that time were not highly educated. They were not used to preaching regularly. Sermons were reserved for festival days, like Easter and Christmas. That's it. And even then, Charlemagne suspected that the priests mostly talked about their own ideas. There was way too much biblical interpretive freedom, he felt. So he ordered his advisors to create two things: a common lectionary, so that everyone in every town would hear the same biblical texts every week, and a book of sermons called a homiliary. Isn't that a great word? Homiliary. That provided exactly the right sermons for these texts. Just think, no more struggling to prepare your own biblical sermons. It was all done for you. And this was not an optional subscription series. It was required. It was the law. The people had to go to church, and the priests had to preach from the lectionary and the homiliary. Now, most of the books that I have read about this period emphasize that this is what they call it, the Carolingian Renaissance after Charlemagne. The Carolingian Renaissance, this is how they refer to the period, was notable for its renewal of biblical preaching, which by that time had fallen into a dismal state. And the genius of Charlemagne, they say, is that he recognized the power of a sermon to transform a culture, and so labored to bring biblical preaching into every corner of Europe. Well, that's part of the story, but it is not the whole story. Because if the renewal of biblical preaching means that we all preach the same sermon disseminated by the same preacher every Sunday, that is not Renaissance, that's empire. That is centralized control of the pulpit, and that scares me to death. I don't know about you. Well, let's go back to Appleton and to that pastor's question. What do you think of biblical preachers like Rick Warren who encourage others to preach their sermons? Now, I'm not going to get into a critique of Pastor Rick's motives. I have never met him. I have never talked with him about this. I don't believe any good ever comes from slamming other preachers, ever. I am going to assume, let's assume together, that Pastor Rick genuinely wants to do good, not evil, by selling subscriptions to the biblical sermons that are prepared for his congregation, right? Let's assume the man loves God and loves his people. With that in brackets, however, I do think it is fair to examine the effects of this practice. What happens to us as biblical preachers if we preach someone else's sermons? What happens to our people? And what do we gain and what do we give up by giving over our biblical interpretive freedom to someone else? Now, let me pause here for a minute to say I am not trying to shame anybody by asking these questions. I take it for granted that you and I are preachers. We are preachers, we are busy, we are human. Very few of us have not borrowed extensively from another preacher we admire at least once, right? I think it's one of those experiences a preacher has to have, actually. You have to know what it feels to preach what is not yours. You have to cross the line before you see where it is. It's like an adolescent, waking up the morning after the party with a headache and a heartache and a terrible feeling in your gut that you went too far last night because that isn't who you are to act that way, to say those things. That isn't who you are to let yourself be swept along. It's a hard thing to stand in your own life. Every teenager knows that. And it is a hard thing to stand in your own sermon. Every preacher learns that. And we have to keep practicing because we aren't going to do it every week without a lot of help and work. So please, don't take these questions that I'm asking as a finger-pointing moment. No, bad dog, all of you. You know that? Yeah. What I hope we can do is to start a conversation that I think we need to have as biblical preachers about the particular challenges that have crept up on us in the last 10 years. Because it isn't just that the internet tempts us to plagiarize and so compromise our ethics. No, the internet at its worst, the internet tempts us to trade access for interpretive freedom. And when you give up your interpretive freedom as a preacher, you give up your sacred calling to be a minister of the word and sacrament, as we say in my Presbyterian tradition. I think Charlemagne would love the internet. It is the mother of all homiliaries. It can give you any biblical sermon you want, anywhere, anytime. And you don't need a master's degree to work it. You just have to know how to read. Click a few keys, and you can find advice about the most efficient and successful way to preach the gospel in any conceivable situation. It's like having your own personal court of advisors, if you don't mind that they all say the same thing. Because here's what the internet cannot do. It can't mediate wisdom. It can't mediate faithfulness. It can't mediate love. It can't interpret information, it just spits it out, which makes our interpretive job bigger than ever because now we have to sort through the volume to find the value. Rick Warren says he would like to help with this. Subscribing to his sermons, he says, can save time and money and souls because, it says on his website, biblical truth is the same from age to age, and the numbers in his church testify to the truth in his sermons. Whoa, listen to that. Now, the problem is that he, for that very reason, becomes a sort of Charlemagne for us. The saddleback homiliary is not very different from the Holy Roman Empire's homiliary, no matter how well intended it is. Each contains the sermons of famous preachers. Each professes to be a tried and true collection, thereby guaranteeing a measure of success. Each contains biblical sermons that are one size fits all so that you can preach them anywhere. And while Charlemagne had the legal power to demand our compliance, Pastor Rick has the postmodern equivalent, which is the power of numbers. And that is very hard to resist in a recession, isn't it? Yeah, and that's the very issue, I think, resistance. I used to think borrowing sermons, I haven't been teaching all that long either. This is just my 12th year at Columbia. I used to say it was a matter of ethics and integrity. Don't do it without permission or footnote citation, all the other copyright issues that the internet has complicated beyond belief. But as long as you don't try to claim it's yours if it isn't, or that you wrote it if you didn't, sure, go for it. Preach someone else's sermon. That's fine as long as you do it properly. That was before I went to Appleton and my little blast from the historical past via Wisconsin. And now I wonder why it took me so long to see. Preaching someone else's sermons, I think, is a lapse back into the Dark Ages. It is bowing down to the emperor and not to the Lord Jesus Christ. It is one more step toward Charlemagne's homiliary, where we all preach the same text in the same way for the same purpose, which is to create well-behaved citizens of the empire. But here's what else it does. Preaching someone else's sermons is giving into what I like to think of as the tempter, that little insidious voice in your head that is always, always trying to convince you that you don't have what it takes to do this. You aren't good enough, you aren't smart enough, and gosh darn it, people really don't like you. If you were a real biblical preacher, you would have the numbers to prove it. If you were a real biblical preacher, you would have the answers to any question that gets lobbed your way. If you were a real biblical preacher, your congregation wouldn't fight, your roof wouldn't leak, your programs wouldn't fizzle, you wouldn't be sitting at your computer every Saturday night alone with your virtual sermon that has yet to bless you with its appearance. Real biblical preachers do not have these problems. They have multiple campuses. They are growing to a community near you. They have thousands of pastors from all over the globe downloading their sermons. What do you have, huh? Just Goliath. And one virtual sermon week after week. Preaching someone else's sermons is an act of surrender. This is true. To the emperor, to the tempter, and to all that is counter to gospel. I don't care if it's the most brilliant sermon ever. If we give up our sacred right to interpret the scriptures, if we throw away God's gift of engaging this word and living in it ourselves, we lose the very thing that gives us life and keeps the church alive. There may be no greater act of resistance these days than a fresh act of interpretation. A sermon that you prepared yourself. Not because you're so great at it, but because God is great. And grace is real. And there is no substitute for living smack in the middle of that yourself. So let's turn to the third name in the title, Survivor Man, whom I have come to think of as truly one of the untapped metaphors for the contemporary preacher. How many of you have heard of Survivor Man? Oh, good. I wish I had brought a clip. I had not heard of Survivor Man until recently. I came home one evening, found my husband and two teenage sons riveted to the television screen with a fervor that is usually reserved in our house for the NFL, the NBA, and James Bond. And there they were, transfixed about this program that has run on television, which, if you have not heard it, is described by one writer this way. This is what Survivor Man is. The title refers to the host of the show, Canadian filmmaker and survival expert Les Stroud, who must use his skills to survive for 7 days alone in remote locales with little food, water, and equipment. During the filming of each episode, Stroud is alone and operates all the cameras himself. He is equipped with only his clothes, camera equipment, his harmonica, his Leatherman multi-tool, you know, Leatherman, yeah, and a few everyday items relevant to the episode's particular survival scenario. For safety purposes, Stroud carries an emergency satellite telephone. However, Stroud has claimed that while filming several episodes, there were times when his emergency phone did not work, leaving him totally alone. On a few occasions, Stroud has also been provided with a rifle for safety reasons or as part of the survival situation. Les Stroud stopped filming Survivor Man after the third season due to what he described as the significant physical toll of filming each episode. You really do need to see a clip of this to believe it, and I'm sure you can find it, Survivor Man, in your local library or on Netflix or by asking any adolescent male within reach. Watch an episode because it really makes you glad to live in a place where you are not required to eat tree beetles and tree crabs for a week, and since the camera is running, to look as if you are enjoying this protein, which is my point. The antidote to empire is not to spend 7 days in the Kalahari, the Amazon, or the Alaskan wilderness. The opposite of borrowing someone else's sermon is not to turn yourself into Survivor Man preacher. Les Stroud is really fun to watch, but even he had to stop filming the series when the intestinal parasites and the extreme conditions started to take their toll. So let's be clear. Biblical preaching does not require us to enter the text equipped only with a Leatherman and the shirt on our backs. Les Stroud and John the Baptist may subsist on locusts between sermons, but that is not necessarily God's call to you. In fact, survival is a pretty limited goal for a sermon. If we get to the point as biblical preachers when all we are trying to do is stay alive on camera, maybe it is time to pick another role model for ourselves. Jesus said, "Go forth into all the world, not just into the Australian outback by yourself to prove a point." Biblical preaching is arduous. Yes, of course it is. It is. But it is not a survival contest. You do not have to prove that you can do it totally alone. In fact, you do not have to do it alone at all. At all. My husband is a Presbyterian minister who now teaches in a Waldorf school. Do any of you know Waldorf education? Yeah. I'm not going to even try to. No. Waldorf education is based on the philosophy of Rudolf Steiner. One of its hallmarks is that teachers offer every lesson in narrative form. Every teacher starts with a text, so to speak. It's the particular concept, the skill, the historical period, the myth that the students are going to learn about. And then the teacher strives to create a story which will present the lesson in a way that is particular to the class. The key word here is strive. Waldorf teachers believe that it is just as important for their students to see them striving as it is for the students to strive themselves. They also do not try to reinvent the wheel every day. They share ideas, the teachers, they share wisdom, they tell one another what worked, what didn't, but they don't tell the same story. They don't teach in the same way because they are different and their students are different. And if they don't strive to speak into that difference, their students won't either. I couldn't preach if I had to do it in isolation. I am sure about that. Completely sure. I couldn't preach without sharing ideas, talking. I doubt any of us could. And that's one of the blessings of the internet now, the way it connects us. I didn't really mean for this to be a commercial, but really, I think In the Company of Preachers has done maybe the best job of any website in providing that kind of good connection. weaving us together in webs of information and resources and possibilities that feed our preaching and strengthen it. And that's a wonderful gift. It's a wonderful gift. But, when the ideas become a substitute for our own biblical interpretation, week after week, well, I think we've stopped striving. And our people see it. Even worse, I think they stop striving to read and interpret the text themselves. Why should they? We've shown them that we prefer the quick fix ourselves. And there's a sermon dealer on every corner. There's nothing you can't buy, not even gospel. I tell my students at Columbia that the internet is heroin. Do it once on a Saturday night. You won't be able to stop yourself from doing it again. Pretty soon you'll be a crack baby preacher, living from one fix to the next. Now, I can say that kind of thing in a seminary. It's my job to scare the hell out of them so that they don't miss the heaven that's all around them. But, their students, in their context, they think I'm just another teacher trying to keep them from downloading a sermon the way you can download a term paper. They are just trying to survive the semester, Get me through midterms. I'll never do it again, I promise. But it is not about one semester. This is about your life, I tell them, and your people's lives, and the lives of the church. I don't know if all of them can grasp it yet, but they will. And they do, eventually. All it takes is to look in the eyes of one preacher who's given up and stopped believing that grace is real, and it is for them too, even them. That's all it takes. Oh, to be a biblical preacher is to face the same old Goliath every day with no army to back you up. So what do? Well, the simplest thing, I think, oh gosh, it's the Maria von Trapp thing, I just realized, is to go back to the beginning. Well. Sorry, it just suddenly hurt her. It is. The simplest thing is to go back to the beginning, the things you knew first. Long before you knew Greek or Hebrew or Luther's catechisms, or even that there were such beings as biblical preachers. The simplest thing is to meet Goliath in his own story. To walk right in, look around, which you all know how to do, all of you. And your people do too. So I want to move to that now, reading at 1 Samuel, the 17th chapter. And the people who have, well, they didn't really volunteer. They were co-opted to help me with this, are the people that I found first today. So that's why they're here. They walked in, and they happened to be the first people I saw at 8:30, and I handed them something. So 1 Samuel chapter 17. Hear the word of God.
Now the Philistines gathered their army for battle. They were gathered at Sukkah, which belonged to Judah, and encamped between Sukkah and Azekah, in Ephes-dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel,
"Why have you come out to battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you
And the Philistines said,
Today, I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together.
When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul into the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went into battle with Eliab were the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. Jesse said to his son David,
David, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain in these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers fare, and bring some token from them.
Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was coming forth to the battle line, shouting their war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the Israelites, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. The Israelites said,
Have you seen this man who came up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. Now, the king will greatly enrich the man who kills him, and will give him his daughter, and make his family free in Israel.
David said to the men who stood by him,
What shall be done to the man who kills this Philistine and takes away his reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?
the people answered him in the same way.
Well, so shall it be done for the man who kills him.
His eldest brother, Eliab, heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He said,
Hey, why have you come down? With whom have you left the sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart. You've just come down to see a battle.
David said,
What have I done now?
He turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul,
Let no one's heart fail because of them, for your servant will go and fight this Philistine.
Saul said to David,
You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you're just a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth.
But David said to Saul,
Look, your servant used to keep sheep for his father whenever a lion or bear came to the lamb from the flock. I went after it, and I struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God.
David said,
The Lord who saved me from
So Saul said to David,
Go, and may the Lord be with you.
Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul,
I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them.
So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David,
Am I a dog that you come at me with your tie
and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David,
Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field.
But David said to the Philistine,
You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. So this very day, the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and so that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it into my hand.
when the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, grasped his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him, then cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The troops of Israel and Judah rose up with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. So the wounded Philistines fell on the way to Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. The Israelites came back, chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. When Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army,
Abner, whose son is this young man?
Abner said,
As your soul lives, O king, I do not know.
the king said,
Inquire whose son the stripling is.
on David's return from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Saul said to him,
Whose son are you, young man?
and David answered,
I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite.
You can go speak to these wonderful pastors and teachers later. Here's my prayer for you. When you are striving over your next sermon, when Goliath crests the hill and brandishes his spear and tries to pick a fight with you by yelling, "Give me a sermon text that we may fight together," when you are striving, if someone offers you a suit of interpretive armor that doesn't fit you, don't wear it. Don't wear it if you're not used to it. Especially don't wear it if it's the emperor's armor. And don't preach the emperor's sermon if it isn't yours. You don't have to. Not when you have this text. So go back to what you know. Go talk to your friends. Go take them down with you to the wadi. Let them hunt for some smooth stones, stones that fit comfortably in your hands with your own slingshot. And that is enough to take down a giant. Really. Really. You know what people will say? Inquire whose child the stripling is. So you tell them, I am a preacher. I am a biblical preacher and a child of God. Amen. I'm done early. You're great. You're really good. Yeah, people want whatever they want.
We've got a little time for some conversation with Hannah. We'll have Gail and Laura as a note roll for Larry speakers. So if you don't have your question formed yet, you don't have a chance to ask it, know that you can bring it back in. Or playing it in the home. But for now, a little bit of time, so if there are questions or comments to add to the conversation, please feel free to stand up. And rather than run around the mic like crazy, we'll just ask you to project until someone offers.
I have a question. Earlier this year, I received a piece of pastoral junk mail from a preacher in another state who was providing a service I think was geared towards smaller congregations where he would send out a DVD of himself preaching and would also fix you up with a projector and a screen.
Wow, that's enterprising.
And first of all, I thought, well, he shouldn't have sent it to me because he's trying to take my job. But in my area, we have a lot of smaller congregations, churches that are not to serve. They're all installed pastors. So that's it's a difficult situation, but I also think it's kind of presumptuous on that person's part. What are your thoughts?
What are my thoughts? Yeah, maybe not everyone heard that. It was a piece that this pastor received in the mail offering a sermon series with DVDs and even the offer to connect you up with the proper technological equipment to project the sermon. What do I think about this? I think it's unmediated technology. I think it's a very step toward what we're talking about, what I was trying to think about. And here's the thing that I've learned. I live in Atlanta where there are 1 million preachers, okay? Most of them have never been to seminary. One of the real beautiful things that my colleague Joe Roberts, who's a new professor on our staff, Joe Roberts is the retired pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. He was there for 32 years. He succeeded Martin Luther King Sr. He did go to seminary and all kinds of places, but he is very connected to many pastors in Atlanta who have thriving ministries in, tiny storefront churches as well as huge congregations, who have never had the privilege of many of us. And we have started having conversations with these pastors to see if there are ways that we can learn from them and they can learn from us as a faculty. What that has done has stripped me of my presumption that you can only do this stuff, once you pass through my door with my stamped degree and all that. And it has helped me to learn more acutely the great love of the text and the enormous desire to preach that so many Christians have, that will be lived out in some way, even if seminary does not become part of that equation. I'm not trying to glorify anything. There's one of the reasons Joe Roberts, my colleague, has wanted to hook us up is he says there's a lot of really horrible theology going on at these churches. So we're trying to have mutual conversations. But it has made me realize how presumptuous it is of me to assume that a video, a DVD of a preacher, is better than a human being striving with the text in front of you, even if that human being is even if that human being happens to be members of your youth group reading aloud a story the way we just did. How incredibly presumptuous of me to think that the word relies on my degree. So I've had to rethink some things. We also have some other weirdo technology stuff going on in Atlanta. There's a church that the pastor right now has, I guess, I said it's never okay to critique another preacher. I'm critiquing a practice, okay? They've outgrown their sanctuary, so they have another sanctuary, and the weeks that he's not preaching in one of them, there's a hologram of him in the other church. Okay, I want you to think what theologically that's telling everyone in the congregation. That's extraordinary to me. And I think it's a step toward empire. And it is a step away from what we really could be trying to do in a time like this, a shortage of pastors that I know we have. We have this in the Presbyterian Church as well. This is a perfect time for us to encourage our laity to be reading Scripture and wrestling in the way that we have normally reserved for ourselves. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about biblical illiteracy. I have some pretty strong feelings about our role in that. I think that's worked to our advantage. If you're the only one who can read, you get to decide what everything means. I think it kind of works for us as preachers if we're the only ones who know and can tell you who Abraham is. But you teach people to read, and as we know from the two-thirds world, if you give women a 5th grade education, they can change their families' lives. What would a 5th grade education biblically look like for our people? Well, I see a ton of that in Atlanta and beyond 5th grade. I don't mean to sound patronizing at all. I see faithful pastors who are doing amazing ministry because their hearts are with this text. So I want to work with them and learn from them. And maybe it's time for us to do more of that instead of, I get that this person is trying to create a ministry. I get it. But I want to learn from human beings. Okay, anyone? Yes, hi.
This question relates to the technology that we might use in preaching.
Yes.
Years ago, when I was on the sabbatical, we worshiped in one church that as the preacher was preaching, there were screens on both sides of him.
Yeah.
That were projecting different images. And I was wondering what your thoughts were concerning that. Is
know. I would hate to make a hard and fast rule about that. I guess I would want to know, and I actually have preached in some venues where there is a screen. I guess for me what's important is really to ask, who's the subject? If the subject becomes the preacher, we're always in trouble. And if we begin to think that our preaching is dependent on everyone seeing our most minute gesture, oh, wow, that's, on the other hand, I don't want to say that that's an always awful thing, because there may be places when that's very meaningful for people.
I guess the reason I asked,
Yeah.
it seemed like one of the things that I noticed as I was listening to him, I was also watching the screen.
Well, that's exactly what happens. Yeah, okay.
As I was watching some of the younger children, they were focused upon the screen, so maybe the younger segment of the congregation was getting more out of it than just the preacher.
Well, we've trained them really well, haven't we? We've sat them in front of the television from the time they were born. And so you turn a television on, and I don't care where they are, they're like little lemmings. They all go like this. I mean, all you have to do is walk into a restaurant or a sports bar and try to not watch the screen, and it is physically impossible. It will always take your attention. So I think these things have to be thought through really carefully. One of the things that I would continue to ask is, do we think it's not worship unless there's a screen? Or do we think it's not a sermon unless we have, clips of something? Because you guys are too dumb to sort of figure anything out on your own, so I'm just going to always give you a clip to keep you entertained. That becomes very worrisome for me. I don't think we give the text enough credit. How amazing this story is. I mean, I don't know about you. I had a lot of fun watching them. I had a lot of fun watching him. And we didn't rehearse this or anything. I mean, I just handed them the text verbatim. This is NRSV. And I said, okay, so just do it. And they did. I think it's always more interesting than we are. So my caution, I guess, for myself is always to start there, rather than to go immediately to filler. Yes.
One of the most troubling things I've seen lately that seems to limit the word was a worship bulletin from another congregation where the front of the bulletin was a fill-in-the-blank version of the sermon.
Oh my gosh.
So that you would fill in words, listen for specific.
No parishioner left behind. No, that's horrifying. Okay. No. Okay, just stop right there. That's just so bad. Okay. If you need, I say this to my students a lot, it's one of the great things about being a teacher who can occasionally become an intimidating personality, is if you need big, scary people in the back of your head to Goliath you, if you ever attempt to try this, I'm happy to volunteer. You can put me in the back of your head, put Goliath in the back of your head, anyone. What that communicates to me is, unless you're paying attention to what I wanted to give you in the sermon, why way, you flunk. And one of the things I fight with my students, a fight for my students, is to free them from, I know we have a great education system in this country, I'm not going to get into that, but frankly, the tyranny of some of the effects of that system, which is all about spitting out one answer in multiple choice. And God help us if we decide sermons are going to do the same thing. Oh my gosh. All you have to do is ask a question of a 5-year-old, and they'll start going. They're paying attention. They're totally paying attention. Maybe not on the level that we certainly not at the same place where another person is, but they will. One of the best stories, or instances of this, I saw recently was my colleague who is 32, so last year he was 31, yeah. Remember that, those of you who were, when that was a long time ago? Yeah. So he has two small, wonderful little boys. Last year they were 2 and 4. They were listening to their dad's sermon in chapel. This is at the Columbia Chapel. And this family is wonderful. They bring their kids right up front so the kids don't feel like they can't see. And they're very used to listening to preaching because their father preaches, their mother preaches, So in the middle of the sermon, Matt Fleming, my colleague, says something about killing, we're killing this or something. At which point Jackson, almost 4, stands up, goes over to his father, pulls on his pants and says, "Daddy, killing isn't nice." And his father, instead of, just sort of looked at him and said, "You're right, it isn't. And we're going to talk more about that. So sit and, here, listen to what else is going on." What that taught me is, again, how they are paying attention in their own way. So what? We think they need to color. Coloring is good. But just prompt them. They'll tell you what they're listening to. Just ask. Just ask. We started to ask our kids early, kind of as an experiment, just because, they're preachers' kids and you can experiment on your own kids, right? So we started to ask them, pretty early on, what did you think about that? What did you think of the sermon? Just as a practice, maybe you do that too. And because we don't worship in a congregation where we're preaching, it doesn't become all about us. But we just would discuss it. And I remember this Sunday, my oldest, who was then 10, said, I thought he started out really well with his point, and then he totally lost it by the second paragraph, and I couldn't figure out what he was saying again until the end. And I thought, whoa, you're right. That's exactly what happened. And I just wanted to hit myself for ever thinking, my kid is not particularly motivated to listen to sermons any more than any other kid. Okay. What else is on your mind? Yeah.
When you said the subject is the preacher, we're all in trouble, I'm wondering how we can respond to even more low-tech efforts on the parts of congregations to make it about the preacher. I came into a congregation where they love to say, who's preaching this week and list that.
Don't tell them. Yeah.
It's about worship, and this is just one piece.
How do we keep it from coming? How do we keep it from becoming all about us? Well, first of all, they say that because they love you, and because they're well-mannered people, and in the culture, this is how we behave well. And church is a different culture, and so we are teaching them different things in which the subject is not a human being, and it is not about. It is not always about our leadership, and we don't always have to keep caressing one another about that. All the things, Haddon was talking about that this morning. It's not always about the Buick. But that's the culture, and so they're doing what they think is a supportive thing to do. And I don't know, I think there are a couple things you can do. I know some pastors of some pretty big churches who do not advertise who's going to preach. They just flat out don't do it because they don't want to get into this thing with multiple staff. I even know of a congregation that had Youth Sunday every 5 or 6 weeks because for this congregation it was really important to mentor young people into interpreting Scripture because the culture tells them one thing and we are going to tell them, no, it is important for you to learn how to stand up and speak for yourself and proclaim your truth as a child of God. And people got upset because they didn't want to come to church on the Youth Sunday days. They wanted to go when, I won't say who the big famous person is, when he was preaching. Well, they just took it off the radar. You would call up and they'd say, there's a sermon. So we just have to figure out ways, I think, to keep our ego out of it. And when I'm at the door with people, when they start doing the well-mannered thing, you want to talk about in the South, people have such beautiful manners. Such beautiful manners. And, they thank you for your message, and they thank you for this, and they thank you for that, because they're lovely, Right, and then they tell you how pretty your shoes are and everything. And So I've started just automatically responding. It's a great text, isn't it? You know, just turn the conversation back around. It's a great text. I hated working on this text. This was a kick your butt text for me. You know, and let them try to keep cueing them so that it's about what I'm trying to say to them is it was about my engagement with the text this week, and it wasn't all really fun. But, you know. Hey.
A couple of things. Number one, I think it's, since we're thinking about bringing some video behind me, and since I have no idea how to do all of that, I worry a little bit. But the other, I do believe that people learn in different ways.
Yeah.
They may be auditory, they may use sight.
Mm-hmm.
And we do learn. Sometimes it confuses us, but it depends on where we are. And secondly, I think it's important to note that it's not the little children who have merely been trained by television. I grew up with the television.
Yeah, so did I.
And watching something behind does not distract me. It adds to it. So what do you think?
What do I think?
How do I fix this?
Yeah. I wish I were a neurologist because I do understand from the little reading I've done that our brains really are different in this generation, those of us who have had more of this. And there's some people who speak very coherently on that and helpfully, and yeah. That said, I think we're going to have to try a lot of things and make a lot of mistakes and be willing to shift around. I think it's hard because it's expensive. You know, and I've heard of congregations in which, of course, we all want to see the screen up front, so where are we going to put it? Right in front of the cross, and then it's going to come back up when we need it. You know, it's going to, and so I worry about the symbolism of that. But I think we're just going to have to try. I also think that I grieve for the day, if it ever comes, but I'm sure, you know, part of getting older is that everything was always better before, right? You know, so I think one of the things I hope we don't give up is this moment of oral interpretation with human beings, because this is the last place in our culture that we have this. We don't get it anywhere else. I think it's one reason, frankly, why Barack Obama inflamed so much of our imagination as a country is that he's such a great preacher. You know, and he knows how to use imagery in profound ways, and look what it did. So what I don't want to do is jump really fast to the other before we fully, but, you know, yeah, we got to try it and see how it goes and talk to one another and protect each other from the stuff that doesn't work. We're good?